Okay, hi everyone. We'll get started now. So my name is Pranava. I graduated from Temple this past May, and now I'm in a master's program that I'll be finishing this May as well. And then I'm currently applying. If you guys have any questions after or during the session, just feel free to interrupt me either by unmuting your mics or chatting. And if you see something wrong with anything I say, feel free to correct me. So before we get started, here's just a few things that we wanted to bring to your attention. Because we're all just volunteers, we do have this GoFundMe so that you can help us try to reach more students. Completely optional, but please do donate if you feel like it. And then we also do have a Facebook group to find study buddies while you're on your MCAT journey. And then the email that you should contact if you have any questions about anything, whether it's the topics that we discussed today, any future sessions, any volunteering opportunities we may know of, or if you ever just need any help in your MCAT or your pre-med journey, feel free to reach us. We'll try to help you as best as we can. And lastly, we also have this new MCAT mentoring program. We have about 20 people signed up so far, and we're in the process of matching you up with mentors right now. So if you didn't already sign up for that and that's something you're interested in, that's up there for you. And now I'll also put the link in the chat. So there it is. Yeah, does anyone have any questions before we start? All right, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so today we're going over the excretory system. So I'll just mostly be doing this in 3 parts. We'll very briefly look at the roles of the kidney, of the excretory system at the very beginning, and then also very briefly go over the kidney structure, and then most of the time we'll be focused on the nephron structure. And if you guys are completely unfamiliar with what the nephron is, it's basically like the functional unit of the kidney. So we're looking at kind of the micro level of the kidney function, and we'll also talk about the things like hormones and stuff that regulate its function. So it's just kind of an overview. All right. So this is a chart that I tried to make to kind of simplify everything that this system does. The overall goal of this whole system is to maintain various types of homeostasis, and it regulates blood pressure, osmoregulation. So this is the salt concentration of fluids. It can be defined in more technical terms, but basically what osmoregulation is just controlling the level of salt in fluid. And then the third function, the third kind of homeostasis is acid-base balance. And this is simply by controlling how much bicarbonate and proton is excreted and reabsorbed into the body or excreted in the urine. And then lastly, this is probably the most straightforward function, and this is just the removal of soluble nitrogenous waste. So because we consume amino acids, you generate ammonia from that, but that's toxic to our body. So this is converted into urea, and then that's excreted in the form of urine. So acid-base balance and removal of nitrogenous waste are pretty straightforward, but there's a bit more to dive into in regards to blood pressure. So we'll also be talking about the renin-angiotensin pathway. This is also called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, as well as talking about these 3 hormones: aldosterone, ADH, and atrial natriuretic peptide. And then next, in terms of osmoregulation, that is just, so I said it's controlling how much salt is in the fluid. So this is done by controlling ion secretion and reabsorption, and the hormone aldosterone also controls this function of the kidney. Sorry, just give me a second while I look up. Okay. So this is basically what the kidney looks like. Obviously, this is one of them. There's another one on the other side. Um, so there's not too much you need to know about this other than to just understand what it looks like and also these three parts that I have circled in red. So the medulla is this inner part of the kidney. Um, so I'll get more into that in the next slide. And then the cortex is just this outer layer. And then the only other thing that I think you really need to know are the renal artery, and arteries bring in circulation from the heart to the organ, and then the renal vein carries away the blood supply from the kidneys to the rest of the body to be um, reoxygenated, et cetera, et cetera. And then the only other thing is the ureter, which dumps the final filtrate product into the bladder to be excreted. Okay. So this is kind of the most important part that's tested on the MCAT. So the nephron, as I mentioned earlier, it's the functional unit of the kidney. There's about 1 million of them, I think, in each kidney. So if you look at this image on the right, this is the blown up picture of the nephron. And if you think about where that's situated in the kidney, you can see how the colors match. So the cortex is in the lighter beige color, and then the medulla is the darker beige. So the upper part of the nephron lies in the cortex, and then the lower part lies in the matrix. Um, so if you just to think about how that's situated exactly, you can see this collecting duct, which is the ending part of the nephron. It drains into, sorry, if I situate you back into this side, it drains into this area, and then eventually that's carried by um, the ureter down to the bladder to be excreted. So I hope you can see how this zoomed in version of the nephron fits into the kidney. Okay. Um, so also on this image, you can see the various parts of the nephron that are highlighted. The first part is the glomerulus, and then go here into the proximal tubule, which has two parts. The proximal convoluted tubule, which is this twisted stuff, so that's why it's called convoluted. And then a little bit up here is the proximal straight tubule, but you don't hear too much about that, so it's okay as long as you know proximal tubule. And then the next part is this whole thing called the loop of Henle. This is the descending loop and then the ascending loop. And then go follow the tubules and you get to the distal convoluted tubule, which is again, it's all twisted up here, so that's the convoluted part. And then if you follow that through, you get to the collecting duct, which is the final part of the nephron. And again, this dumps out into the ureter, and this will have your final urine product. So some terminology before we get started. The filtrate is the fluid inside the nephron tubules that will be excreted as urine. So when it's in any of this part of the nephron, so like the earlier or anytime it's not completely the final product, you call that the filtrate. This is because the filtrate contains waste product, but it also has substances that must be reabsorbed in the tubules before excretion, so it's not called urine just yet. And then the lumen is the inside of the nephron tubules. So on this image, this is a lumen. I know this is kind of a bit of a confusing orientation, but if you can think of the tubule as being, this is the outer part of the tubule, and then this would be the other outer part of the tubule. So to take you back into this picture, anything that's the inside of this part the blue part, that would be called the lumen. Yeah, so that's the lumen, and these are the exterior cells of that tubule. And then you have the interstitial fluid here, and then this is the capillary. And so when things are excreted, or sorry, when things are reabsorbed, that's the next term. It's called taking it away from the lumen of the tubules into the bloodstream. Because remember that whatever's in the tubules, and if it doesn't get reabsorbed, it's going to be excreted as urine. So when you're talking about reabsorption, that's taking it back into the body, into the bloodstream. So excretion and secretion is just the opposite. You're coming in from the bloodstream into the lumen. This is again because if you're bringing stuff you have from the bloodstream into the tubules, and then it's going to get secreted out of the body. Anyone have any questions on that? Because I think this is one of the confusing parts. Okay. So the first part of the nephron that we'll be talking about is the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So to orient you on this picture, the glomerulus is this part, and the Bowman's capsule is the kind of like the starting of the tubule system of the nephron. So it's just kind of this cup that sits around, cup-like structure that sits around the glomerulus, because the glomerulus is essentially this ball of capillaries situated between the afferent artery, which brings in blood from the body into the kidneys and nephrons. So it's the first extension of the renal artery we saw earlier. And then from the afferent artery, you get the glomerulus, system of capillaries, and then once you travel away from the glomerulus, this is the efferent artery. So what glomerular filtration is, if you think about it, these arteries and capillary system are bringing in everything that you have in the body. So everything that you have from digestion that has found its way into the bloodstream. This is the first point of contact between all of that found in the blood and the nephron. So this is the first site where things in the bloodstream get excreted or secreted into the nephron. So, and the force that drives this is simply the hydrostatic pressure that exists because arteries have high blood pressure. So the force of that blood pressure pushes out that fluid, so the H2O, nutrients, and essentially any other small molecules such as urea, any other ions, etc. And what it retains are the bigger substances like red blood cells, bigger proteins, or anything else that shouldn't be excreted into the filtrate because they're too big. So in summary, the glomerulus is the first time we filter out excess fluid and waste products from the bloodstream into the tubules of the nephrons. And the last thing to mention here is that ANP is a hormone that increases glomerular filtration rate. And this hormone is secreted when plasma volume increases to a level that is too high. So in order to bring that back to homeostasis, what ANP does is that it increases the glomerular filtration rate. So what this does is that if your rate increases, you're pushing out more substances into the nephron, into the filtrate per unit time. So it increases urine production. We'll talk more about that later in the hormone section of this session, so don't worry about it too much for now. Just remember that the glomerular filtration is just this bulk excretion of everything that's been in the bloodstream because this is the first point of contact between the bloodstream and the nephron system. Okay. And then one more thing to know about the glomerulus is that, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat now. Yeah, it is important to know how ANP affects the nephron because the hormone effect on the nephron function is often tested, but I actually have a slide on this later on, so I'll go into more detail about that. So, as I was saying, another important, I'm sorry. Another important thing to know about the glomerulus is that there's several ways to change the glomerular filtration rate. I just mentioned the effect of ANP, but another thing that might be tested is how you can change glomerular filtration rate by changing the diameter of the afferent artery, and the efferent artery. So let me just take you back into this picture for a second. So this is the afferent artery, and this is the efferent artery, and here's your glomerulus in between. So the same thing here, just drawn a bit differently to make it easier to visualize. So this is the afferent artery, and this is your glomerulus, and this is your nephron and the tubules, and this is your afferent artery. So what we're looking at here is how changing the diameter of either of these arteries, so either the thing that's bringing it in or taking the bloodstream out, how will that affect what's going on in the middle here? So the first change that we're looking at is constricting the afferent artery. So constricting or decreasing the diameter, as I have on the table, is the same thing. So what this does is that it slows down the blood flow to the glomerulus. And the problem with that is that you have less substances coming in, or it slows down the rate at which things are coming into the glomerulus. So the filtration slows down. And the next change that we're looking at is increasing the diameter of the efferent artery. And again, same effect, it decreases glomerular filtration rate because you have the same amount of same rate of blood flow in, but if you dilate the efferent artery, blood leaves faster, so it gets less time here. So the amount of time each volume of blood gets to spend in this glomerulus to be transferred into the nephron is lower. So the overall glomerular filtration rate decreases because of that. And then 2 ways to increase the glomerular filtration rate is by constricting the efferent arteriole. So again, this is the opposite logic of dilating the efferent artery. So if you increase the diameter of the efferent artery, blood flows out of the glomerulus faster, and then if you constrict it, it slows down the rate of how fast the blood leaves the glomerulus, so it spends more time here, which gives it more of a chance to be filtered out. So you have the time that the blood spends here increases, so the overall glomerular filtration rate increases. And then lastly, another way to increase the glomerular filtration rate is to increase the diameter of the afferent artery. So again, opposite logic of constricting the afferent artery. If you constrict it, the blood spends less blood is coming in per unit time. So if you dilate it, more blood per unit time, more time spent here, increased glomerular filtration rate. Okay. Any questions about anything so far? Okay. So the next part of the nephron, we covered the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, which I'm circling right now. And then the proximal convoluted tubule is what I have circled in red. This part is the proximal straight tubule, but we won't talk too much about that. Basically, this whole part up until the loop of Henle is called the proximal tubule. So if we think about the anatomy of the kidney, there's the cortex and the medulla. The proximal tubule itself is located in the cortex. So it's not on this picture, but the division between the cortex and medulla would be about here. So the proximal tubule and the glomerulus Bowman's capsule and the distal convoluted tubule would all be in the cortex, and then the loop of Henle collecting tubule would be in the matrix. So the function of the proximal convoluted tubule is the bulk reabsorption of glucose, amino acids, ions, otherwise known as salts, water, potassium, urea, phosphate, lactate, citrate, and bicarbonate. But you won't need to list all of these. Basically, it's just kind of reabsorbing everything that it knows not to get rid of, because this is the first site of reabsorption in the nephron. So most of the reabsorption that occurs in the kidney occurs in the proximal tubule. Another thing to remember about how the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs is that it's isotonic reabsorption. This basically means that it doesn't change the osmolarity of the glomerular filtrate. This is something that the loop of Henle does. So what you should remember is that the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs water and salts in such a way that the osmolarity overall is not changed. And then probably the most important thing to know about the proximal convoluted tubule is just that it's bulk reabsorption. So another important thing about the proximal convoluted tubule is that the kind of transport that takes place here is called secondary active transport. So this is called that because sodium is pumped out actively through sodium potassium pumps. And what this does is it sets up transport of other substances so that they can simply diffuse out from the tubules of the nephron into the bloodstream. I have an image of that in the next slide. So hold on just 1 second. And then in the proximal convoluted tubule, the only thing that's really secreted is ammonia. This is the thing that we're trying to get rid of. It's the nitrogenous waste. And also sometimes protons when you're talking about pH controls, so the acid-base balance that we talked about in one of the very early slides. So here is a bigger, here's an image of secondary active transport. So the red arrows point out to the solid red arrow is a primary active transport. So the thing that is being transported out by using ATP is the sodium ions, and then potassium ions are being actively pumped in, but don't worry too much about that because the potassium channels are leaky, so you don't really need to worry about that part. Just know that sodium is actively being pumped out from the tubules of the nephron out from the tubule cells, which is on the border of the tubules, into the capillaries to be taken back into the bloodstream. So what this does is that it establishes a low concentration of sodium here so that sodium diffuses down its concentration gradient from the tubule of the nephron into the tubule cells, and then at that point they're pumped out again. So the advantage of these sodium potassium pumps is that when sodium diffuses through these proton carriers, it facilitates the diffusion of all these other things that have to be reabsorbed. So glucose, amino acids, ions, vitamins, urea, any other substances, water. It facilitates um, the reabsorption of these back into the bloodstream. And just something I wanted to bring up that wasn't in this picture is that there's also the transport of um, sodium and hydrogen in opposite direction. So because you're trying to get rid of a proton in order to maintain the acid-base balance, you have sodium being pumped out of the lumen to be reabsorbed, and then protons being secreted into the lumen to be excreted as part of the urine to maintain that acid-base balance. Okay. Next part of the nephron that we're looking at is the loop of Henle, and this is in the medulla of the kidney. And actually, just thought of something. Sorry, let me go back to this. So on this picture, you kind of see these striations, and these are just because there's a ton of nephrons in this part of the kidney. So these striations are the loop of Henle and collecting duct, and that's why they appear like lines. Not something super important to know, but just for you to orient yourself as to where the nephron lies in the kidney, and that's something that might be useful to conceptualize that a little bit better. Okay, so the loop of Henle's job is basically to concentrate the concentrate the filtrate in such a way that you have reabsorption of salt and water. So they do this by having two separate limbs of the loop of Henle. So there's the ascending limb, which is this part that is not permeable to water. And what happens is salt is actively reabsorbed from the lumen out into the bloodstream, which makes the renal medulla, which is the space, hypertonic to what's in the tubules. So the advantage of making this renal medulla hypertonic is that the descending tubule, which is permeable only to water and not to salt or anything else, allow for the reabsorption of water simply through osmosis, because if this environment is hypertonic to this whatever's in the lumen of these descending limb, then the water that's in the descending limb will flow out into the renal medulla and then back into the bloodstream. And this overall process is called the counter current multiplier system, which is what I have on the next slide. But basically, that's just another way to kind of say what I have written on this slide. So again, just to mention, what happens to the filtrate is that it gets more and more concentrated towards the bottom of the loop. And then because the salt is pumped out at this point again and again, then it gets less hypertonic. I'll show you that in the next slide. But the loop of Henle is a major mechanism of water reabsorption because of this counter current multiplier system. So this is what the counter current multiplier system is. Basically, you can see on this picture, which I have bigger on the next slide as well, you have these numbers which indicate the osmolarity of the filtrate. So it says 300, 400, 600, 900, 1200. So the filtrate is most concentrated at the bottom. So the point of creating this osmotic gradient is that not only does the descending limb use that to reabsorb water. The collecting tubule, which would be over here, can use that as well to reabsorb water in the very last step of the nephron. So to break down what countercurrent and countercurrent multiplier mechanism actually means, countercurrent just refers to the fact that the descending and ascending limb travel in opposite directions. So the descending limb goes from top to bottom, and then the ascending limb goes from bottom to top. And multiplication just refers to the fact that by making the medulla salty, by the ascending limb pumping out salt through active transport, allows water to be reabsorbed um, using simply osmosis by the descending limb. So just to continue to harp on this because it is an important part of the nephron function. I'll take you through this step by step and then I try to explain it to you in several different ways. So first you get the filtrate entering the nephron loop. So this filtrate is isoosmotic, so it has the same osmolarity as the blood plasma and interstitial fluid. So you wouldn't get any any diffusion of water because it's isotonic at that point. But as the renal medulla is made hypertonic to the filtrate in the descending limb, and this is done by the ascending limb pumping out the salt. This causes water to leave the descending limb through osmosis, and as a result, the filtrate starts to get more and more isotonic. More and more concentrated. So I'll try that again. So at the very beginning, when you're entering the loop of Henle, you're isoosmotic to the outside environment, so the bloodstream and the interstitial fluid, so you wouldn't get any movement of water out. But as you travel down the medulla, this environment outside is hypertonic, so there's more salt in it than what's in the descending limb. So as a result, water diffuses down the concentration gradient by going from an area of less salt to more salt. And as a result of that water leaving, your filtrate gets more and more concentrated. However, once you get to the ascending limb, you get the excretion. You get the reabsorption of salt out of the nephron into the bloodstream and interstitial fluid. So something to mention here is that there's two parts to the ascending limb. There's this thick ascending limb and the thin ascending limb. At this part of the ascending limb, salt transport occurs passively because this part is simply more hypertonic to the water, to the filtrate in the nephron at this point, so it can just diffuse passively. But once you reach the thick ascending limb, salt is pumped out actively to make this portion of the medulla hypertonic to the filtrate that's in the descending limb, so that water will diffuse out through osmosis. So at this point, when you're at the very top of the ascending limb, filtrate is most dilute because you've been pumping out this salt. And something it mentions here is that it's so dilute that it's even hypoosmotic to the interstitial fluid, which is the stuff that's outside of the tubule. Not super important to remember, but so is that something you're okay with? You guys just give me like a thumbs up if that's fine. Or if I should repeat the whole thing, I don't know, anything. May, could you just explain a little bit more about what your question is?
I'm sorry, I guess I was confused. I know you were talking about how the descending component excretes water and the ascending component excretes sodium chloride. So you kept mentioning that the solution was hypertonic. So I guess I got confused because I know earlier you mentioned isotonic. So maybe I'm confusing the terms. If you could explain that again.
Yeah, so isotonic, that is just referring to when the osmolarity of the filtrate is equal to the osmolarity of the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that's outside of the nephron. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, yes, yes.
So hypertonic is just when we're referring to the fact that the area outside of the nephron has more osmolarity than the filtrate in the nephron. So that just means that um, there's more salt in the medulla, or sorry, there's more salt outside of the nephron than there is in the nephron. So when there's more salt outside of the nephron, water will flow out into this area to even out that balance. Does that make sense?
Okay, okay.
And
I'm
or
getting it.
did
I'm getting it.
okay. No, keep asking because this is definitely confusing. So if it doesn't make sense, just keep asking. Okay. Is the thin part of the ascending limb inside the nephron higher in salt concentration than the medulla? Yeah, I think that's why um, you have passive transport of NaCl. Otherwise, you would have to use active transport. Thank you. Right. So second to last part of the nephron, finally. This is just a distal convoluted tubule. Not much to know about it other than the fact that it's another site of reabsorption for salt and water. Same thing as before, secretion of um, proton for pH control. The only other thing that's important about the distal convoluted tubule is that it can also secrete potassium, and the secretion of potassium is aldosterone controlled. So this is another hormone that I briefly mentioned earlier. Again, I'll mention this more later on. I have a separate slide on it, but not much to know about the distal convoluted tubule except another site of reabsorption. And the only thing that's distinctive about it is that it has aldosterone controlled secretion of potassium ions. Okay. Very last part of the nephron is the collecting duct. So this is part of the nephron that leads into the ureter to go into the bladder to be excreted as urine. So this is the very final part of the nephron. The location is in the medulla. So again, another site of water, salts, and urea. So it might stand out to you that it's a site of reabsorption of urea because we're trying to get rid of it. So why would you reabsorb it? Reabsorb their urea? And this is just in cases to maintain osmolarity. So while you're excreting most urea, you do need a little bit to maintain osmolarity. So the collecting duct will do this accordingly to maintain that homeostasis of osmolarity. Um, and it's a site of secretion of salts. And again, this is hormone controlled. We'll talk about that in the coming slides. Just a simple fact to know about the collecting tubule is that the distal tubules of actually many nephrons can drain into a single collecting duct. So while on this image we have just one distal convoluted tubule to draining into the collecting ducts, in practice you have a bunch that all drain into one collecting duct. So not too important, just something to mention. So one of the most important things to know about the collecting duct is that the amount of water and urea, but mainly water, that's reabsorbed in the collecting duct is highly, highly dependent on the permeability and tubular concentration of urea in this segment. So this is to simplify what this says. You should basically know that the amount of water that's reabsorbed in the collecting tubule is controlled by this hormone called ADH, which is the anti-diuretic hormone. So it controls the collecting duct by making it more porous by activating aquaporins, which are transport protein that facilitate the transport of water. So the effect of ADH is that it increases water reabsorption. Um, so if you think about if you're retaining more water and less is going into the filtrate, this is going to concentrate your urine further. And the reason for this is that one, it conserves water when you need it, and second, it increases blood pressure because if you increase how much water you're retaining, that increases blood plasma volume, and increased volume leads to increased blood pressure. So all of this is to maintain homeostasis. So because we're at the end of the nephron, I just wanted to include a simple slide of everything that's reabsorbed or secreted at different parts of the nephron. So here we have the top proximal tubule, like I mentioned. This is just a site of bulk reabsorption. It should basically know it reabsorbs a bunch of things simply because this is the first time um, uh, everything that was excreted into the nephrons. This is the first time it's meeting the nephron. So a lot of stuff in that filtrate is valuable to the body and it needs to be reabsorbed. So that's exactly what the proximal tubule does for us. And then going on to this is again the proximal tubule, but just the non-convoluted part. But again, same thing. This is talking about what's getting excreted into the proximal tubule, so things that we want to get rid of. Again, ammonia, because that's the toxic part that we want to get rid of through urine secretion. Any other toxins, active drug compounds, and then protons to maintain that pH balance. And the descending limb of the loop of Henle, you're simply reabsorbing water. Again, this descending limb is not permeable to anything else. On the other hand, the ascending limb is not permeable to water, and sodium chloride, so salt, is actively being pumped out. That is reabsorbed, so it's being taken away from the filtrate, which will become the urine, and then as well as other salts. Lastly, distal tubule, everything that you're reabsorbing is other ions, salts, and water. So nothing too important to know there. The only thing that stands out is that you have potassium, and again, we have protons, but that's something that we're always trying to maintain a balance of to maintain pH balance, acid-base balance. So the only thing that stands out here is potassium, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about aldosterone. Lastly, the collecting duct, you have the main thing here is water, but you also have these other things, salt, bicarbonate, protons. These two are just for acid-base balance. What's getting excreted again? Potassium, protons again, ammonia again. So potassium is here in the collecting duct as well as in the distal tubule. This is because potassium secretion is controlled by aldosterone, which acts both on the distal tubule and the collecting duct. I'll talk more about that in the coming slides. So another important part of the excretory system is this pathway called the renin-angiotensin pathway. The end goal is basically to increase blood pressure to maintain homeostasis. So the first step is that is the conversion of this enzyme called prorenin. So this is a zymogen, aka an inactive enzyme that's going to be converted into renin if there's these conditions. So if the goal of this pathway is to increase blood pressure, there needs to be these circumstances met. So these could be a drop in blood pressure, a loss of blood volume, because if you lower the amount of blood volume, your blood pressure will also drop. A drop in sodium chloride concentration, so salt concentration in the blood, as well as a decrease in filtrate flow rate. So I think the first two are intuitive, but the second two might not be. So just spend some time conceptualizing that and thinking about how that might cause a need to increase blood pressure. So once we have the first step, which is converting the prorenin into renin, renin then cleaves this other zymogen called angiotensinogen into its active enzyme called angiotensin 1. And then from this angiotensin 1, you get angiotensin 2. And this step is catalyzed by the angiotensin converting enzyme, also not known as ACE. You guys probably heard of things like ACE blockers, which are commonly prescribed medicines to lower blood pressure, I think. So what angiotensin does is it causes the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. But in addition to activating the release of aldosterone, angiotensin also constricts arteries. So the effect of this is to directly increase blood pressure. And it also decreases glomerular filtration rate. So if you remember when you were talking about earlier, if you decrease glomerular filtration rate, the blood and blood plasma and everything that's in the bloodstream gets less time to be excreted out into the nephron. So you essentially get to keep more stuff. Here, you increase water retention, so your blood volume goes up, therefore your blood pressure goes up. And then the effects of aldosterone is to increase reabsorption of sodium, and then therefore water reabsorption as well by both the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts. So because you're reabsorbing water, you're also reabsorbing, because you're reabsorbing water back into the bloodstream, you're increasing blood volume and therefore blood pressure. So even though these might all sound like different effects and sound difficult to remember, if you're ever lost, just remember that angiotensin 2 and aldosterone, their end goal is to increase blood pressure by reabsorbing, by somehow causing changes that do that. So that's that. This is just a summary picture that I threw on for you guys, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to keep going. So I'll discuss 3 hormones that control nephron activity. Just start off with aldosterone because that's what we were just talking about. This is a steroid hormone. It's a mineralocorticoid. So it's synthesized and released by the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is part of the adrenal gland, which is just this small gland that sits on top of the kidney. So as we talked about just in the last slide, it's released in response to angiotensin 2 when the renin-angiotensin pathway is activated, or by high potassium concentration in blood plasma. So the effect of aldosterone is to regulate blood pressure, sodium concentration, and salt concentration. So it increases the reabsorption of sodium and then therefore water in both the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts. Again, whole purpose is to increase blood volume and pressure, but something that this also accomplishes is lowering osmolarity of blood plasma. So, and as I was talking about the importance of potassium being mentioned only in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct and the fact that aldosterone acts on these 2 parts is that aldosterone simulates the excretion of this ion. And to lead into the next slide, aldosterone basically has the opposite function of atrial natriuretic peptide, which is ANP. Sorry, let me come back to ADH then. So ANP is a peptide hormone is synthesized and secreted by cardiac muscle cells and atria. So if we break down the name atrial just refers to the fact that that's where it's synthesized and secreted. But natriuretic, sorry to take you down to the slide, but uretic is referring to urine, and natri is referring to sodium. So this is referring to the excretion of sodium in urine. So you can imagine that it's going to increase sodium excretion. So when you increase sodium excretion, it's also going to increase water excretion. And this hormone acts only on the collecting duct. So the overall effect of increasing excretion of sodium and water is to take away water and more sodium from the bloodstream and dump it into the collecting duct. So this is going to be excreted as urine. So overall effect is that you have less blood volume and blood pressure. And then something we talked about earlier is that it increases glomerular filtration rate and glomerular permeability, and this does so by dilating afferent arteriole. If you think about, we were talking about that earlier, so just refer back to that slide if you've forgotten how that works. So by dilating the afferent arteriole, you get increased filtration, so increased time that blood and blood product and substances that are in the blood sit at that glomerulus, so more time to excrete it out into the nephrons. So more water and solutes are excreted into the nephron, so overall blood volume is lowered and therefore blood pressure is lowered. So aldosterone increases blood volume and pressure, ANP decreases blood volume and pressure. Aldosterone acts on the collecting duct as well as the distal convoluted tubule, whereas ANP acts purely on the collecting duct, but also on the glomerulus. So the last hormone is ADH. And this is the antidiuretic hormone. So to break down the name of this hormone, diuretic is that di, so twice, urine, and anti, so it's to prevent excretion of too much urine. It's also known by the name vasopressin, if you've heard of that term used before. I would just know this in case the MCAT throws a question at you where it refers to ADH by something else, but most often it'll be ADH. So it's synthesized in the hypothalamus, but released by the posterior pituitary gland. And it's released in response to decreased blood pressure or hyperosmolarity. So what it does is it increases reabsorption of water by the collecting duct. So again, antidiuretic hormone means that it's going to oppose increased urine production. So the way it's going to do this is by increasing aquaporins in the collecting duct. So if I can direct you to this picture, start by looking at the bottom picture first. So this is when there's no ADH being released. You have a large amount of dilute urine because there's not aquaporins that are caused to be activated by ADH. But if I can move you up to the top picture, this is when ADH is actively present. So you have all these aquaporins being being activated in the collecting duct, and this causes water to be reabsorbed away from the collecting duct into the bloodstream. So you get a concentrated urine and lower volume. So when you're increasing the amount of water that's being reabsorbed, you increase blood volume and therefore blood pressure. And another important thing to remember here is that because you're reabsorbing more water, you're going to be lowering osmolarity of blood plasma. Okay. And then question in the chat, how does ANP lower blood volume and pressure?
So just to ask is it lowering the blood volume and pressure in the arteries, or?
So yeah, so that's actually the bigger picture question. So you're getting more sodium and water to leave into the collecting duct, correct? So it's taking away water from the bloodstream because all the things that you're collecting in the nephrons in the collecting duct of the nephron comes from that first initial comes from the rest of your bloodstream. So when you're increasing how much water is being excreted, it increases basically all the blood volume. So yes, in the arteries, but basically in the whole circulation as well. Does that make sense? Like it's not just in one part. The kidneys regulate like the amount of water, or sorry, not water, but like blood plasma in the whole thing. So when you have this hormone acting on the kidney, it's gonna try to remove excess water um, to lower the whole amount of blood plasma, and the effect of lowering the amount of blood plasma is lowering blood pressure. Okay. And then quickly, that might be tested is that this was a session on the excretory system, but it's on the MCAT. This is very kidney and nephron heavy, but the other part of the excretory system is the ureter, the bladder. So just to mention a little bit about that, on this picture, you see the internal sphincter as well as the external sphincter. The internal sphincter is made out of smooth muscle. And this is controlled by the parasympathetic system, so the autonomic nervous system. So it's not something that you have control over. It's regulated by the autonomic nervous system. On the other hand, this external sphincter is made out of skeletal muscle, which means you can voluntarily control it, and voluntary control is by the somatic nervous system. Just another thing is that the bladder is lined by this muscle called the detrusor muscle, which is this very muscular lining. So the only thing to note about that is that it relaxes to store more urine, and then it contracts during urination to expel that urine. And this is just a urine pathway, but if you follow it, it's essentially the pathway of the nephron. So the Bowman space, I guess there should be glomerulus, Bowman space, proximal convoluted tubule, descending limb of the loop of Henle, ascending limb of the loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, and renal pelvis, which is just where the kidney meets the ureter. So then ureter down to the bladder and then excreted out through the urethra. And just a couple more facts. We're almost at the end. There's two types of nephrons in the body. There's cortical nephrons, which are on the left side of this picture, and then juxtamedullary nephrons. So you can see that they look visually very distinct. So most of the nephrons in a human body are cortical nephrons. So these are like 85%. And the function of these nephrons is regulatory and excretory. So basically the homeostasis functions of the excretory system it does. And so what the juxtamedullary nephrons do, on the other hand, is that they are involved in concentrating or diluting urea. So the distinct physical differences between these two nephrons is that the juxtamedullary nephrons have a much longer loop of Henle, a larger glomerulus, and a larger network of vasa recta, which is the artery system that surrounds the nephron. So in order to conceptualize this, I put a little example down here. Desert mammals have a greater percent of juxtamedullary nephrons. I think I was reading, so we humans have 15% of all nephrons are juxtamedullary nephrons. So camels, for example, are like 30 or 35% juxtamedullary nephrons. And the reason for that is that desert mammals, such as camels, have a need to conserve water. And they do this by concentrating urine. And they can do this because if the loop of Henle is longer, they are able to more, I guess, like exactly control the concentration of the filtrate. So this isn't something that shows up too much, but I know it was a practice problem that I came across. So maybe just something to know briefly. Okay. And this is the last fact that I had. The kidney is the only organ system that has two capillary systems in series. So normally, in any given organ, it goes artery, capillaries, capillary system, and then veins. So more specifically, that could probably be like artery, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. But in the kidney, it's interesting, or in the nephron more specifically, you have this artery, and you get to the first set of the capillary system, which are the glomerular capillary system that we talked about quite extensively. But instead of branching out into the venules and the veins right away, what you meet is this other set of capillary system, and these are called the peritubular capillary system. So this surrounds the other tubules of the nephron. So when we were talking about reabsorption, that's possible because reabsorption back into the bloodstream is possible from the nephrons because these capillaries are very close to the outer layers of these tubules. So everything that's being reabsorbed can kind of diffuse across easily. So not much to know in detail here other than that, it's interesting that the kidneys have two capillary systems in sequence, other than whereas every other organ just has one. So to finish off this sequence, once you get to the peritubular capillary network, that's when you branch out into the venules and then the veins. Okay, we are at the end. Just some final reminders. Again, like please donate to our GoFundMe if that's something that's possible for you and something that you'd like to do. Same thing, Facebook group. And if anything today was confusing but you weren't able to ask right away, just email us at mcat101questions.com at gmail, questions@gmail.com. Yeah, so we'll be making the slides available, I think, if you requested, so just email us, and then also the recording as well. And then actually, yeah, I'll just send out the slides to everyone who registered, because I have questions at the end. I don't want to do this right now because I've been trying harder to keep to time, but the questions are there and then the answers are in the like comments or sections of the slides, so you can refer to that. And if you have any questions about the answers, then you can just email that email and I'll answer it. And yeah, don't be discouraged because I think this is a pretty tough topic. I had a hard time learning about it and it takes a lot of repetition. So just keep studying it, keep reviewing it, and you'll be fine. Anyone else have any questions before we leave? I'll stick around as a last.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I just had a quick question. I know we were talking about blood pressure and, you know, the amount of urine excreted, like all the different hormones, ANP and ADH. So overall, I'm thinking, I was just curious, I haven't really dove deep into it, but would there be a question that combines blood pressure and, you know, this excretory system in one passage? I'm just trying to see how that would even combine.
Yeah, so
imagine, you know, how to combine two different topics. Obviously they're related, but I just don't know how that would work.
Yeah, that's how they always do passages. They want to make sure you know that when they put together topics like blood pressure and the excretory system in one passage, that you're able to understand. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
I guess I just need to come across those kinds of passages because, yeah, I haven't come across it yet. I have sort of looked into the excretory system a little bit, and I have looked into the circulatory system, but when I've done a few practice problems, which is not much as of right now, but I still haven't run into the organ system combination passages, I should say.
Yeah, so they won't like put together like explicitly two organ systems, but the passages, what they do, and the reason why they're difficult for a lot of people is because they put together topics that you might not have studied together. So that's why like things like memorization might not work too well, because you need to like be conceptually capable of putting together things, if you know what I mean. I wouldn't worry about too much about that yet if you're still in your content review system. As like long as you keep practicing the passages, you'll get there.
Okay. Thank you. It's pretty straightforward. I do like all the pictures because after a while, I feel like I'm reading textbooks.
Yeah.
I've had a few doctors, they just have paragraphs in their, PowerPoints. I'm just like, yep, I'll read the textbook on my own. It didn't help me at all.
Yeah, thank you for the
thank
feedback.
you. I
You're
look
welcome.
forward to your next session. I'll definitely donate every paycheck. It's just a process right now. But yeah, thank you so
Yeah, don't
much.
feel obligated to if you're
No,
not
no,
able.
you're cheaper than Next Step Tutoring and all that. Trust me, I've looked at prices. It's
Yeah,
like
you're so
75 an
welcome.
hour, 100 an hour, and I'm like, okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you so much. Bye.
And we'd appreciate if you can fill out the feedback form so we can hopefully keep getting better. I'll send that out in the post session email.
Okay, I look forward to the PowerPoints and ideally the recording, but I don't know if we have to request that.
I'll just send it out to everyone that registered, so you'll get it.
Okay, bye.
Bye, thank you.
Just wanted to say thank you so much. This was actually really it was interesting, and it was, to understand, it was pretty well. It went pretty well. I have to take off though right now.
Yeah, thank you so much.